Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope the online audience can hear me. It is my pleasure to introduce Guy Fagrazzi. He's the director of the Department of Precision Health at the Luxembourg Institute of Health. And he's also the head of the Deep Digital Phenotyping Research. And he'll talk to us about some multidisciplinary research he's doing. And so thank you again for visiting. I'll get this message off, but I can't see the mouse. Yes. Can you see the mouse over there?
Yes. Good. All right. Hello, everyone. And first, I would like to thank you very much, Cecilia, for this invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be in Cambridge today. I really enjoyed the discussions we had before, and I hope now that you will get a better understanding of what we do at the LIH, the Luxembourg Institute of Health, when it comes to voice and vocal biomarkers. Before presenting us and presenting the research we do, I wanted to first explain the why. Why are we doing this research? To make sure we have a common understanding of the context. I've decided to title this presentation Vocal Biomarkers for Minimally Disruptive Clinical Research. So I will try to explain why we want to make sure the future of clinical research is minimally disruptive and how we can use voice to achieve this. Basic information. We are much more than a few biological parameters. And when you look at how clinical research is conducted today, there are many trials still in 2024 using a few biological parameters as primary endpoints to assess the effectiveness of a treatment, an intervention, a drug, whatever. But each individual is very specific. We are all living in a specific environment. We have socioeconomic background, some environmental factors that influence our health, our behavior, our lifestyles. And all of these factors should be taken into account when you assess someone's health. And that's the very foundation of our research. And now, thanks to all the new digital technologies we have at our disposals, there are many ways to capture meaningful information for monitoring or detecting health issues. And this is an example of the field of diabetes that was published by our group a few years ago. Basically now, if you know how to access the right data, you can capture what really matters for the individuals with a specific chronic condition. And we all talk about precision health, precision medicine, but the reality is that we are not there yet at all, actually. If we want to get to the point where we take each individual as a specific person with his or her own environment, needs, contexts, we need first to get to this stage. It will not be straightforward. First, we need to go for the one-size-fits-all medicine to the stratified medicine. And maybe one day we will get to the point where we will be really talking about precision medicine. But now we are here. And the challenge for us as clinical research experts or epidemiologists, that we want to push more towards more precision. And when you start from the left part of this slide, basically you have clinical trials with a control group and a treatment, and you show an average effect or beneficial effect of a drug or a treatment. But that's on average, and we all know that the average person doesn't exist. We need to get more into this stratified approach where you have subgroups, more homogeneous within the subgroups, and we want to push more now with digital technologies to personalize the monitoring and monitoring the response of a treatment or a specific drug. That's the challenge, and that's the target. And my department is called Department of Precision Health. And just to let you know why we decided to label this department Precision Health, we are coming from the field of population health. As epidemiologists, we are interested in looking at populational level information. We want to identify risk factors, prevention strategies that work for the population. But now I think we are living in a very specific moment where we can actually combine the best of the both worlds, between precision medicine, which is very much at the individual level, trying to have a personalized treatment strategy with the population health approach. And all of this is feasible thanks to the enabling technologies we have at our disposal. All the new sensors, the smartphones, the data, AI-driven approaches we can develop, all of this facilitate the combination of precision medicine approaches with population health approaches. And this is why we call ourselves precision health, which in a nutshell can be summarized as the right treatment or the right care for the right person at the right time. I've talked about minimally disruptive clinical research in the title of this presentation, but our framework for conducting our research is what we call the triple burden of a person with a chronic disease. First, you have two burdens out of the three mentioned in this slide, and this is related to this concept of minimally disruptive medicine. Basically, you have the burden of your disease, the burden of illness, and you have the burden of your treatment. And this requires a very delicate balance between the two. If you push too much on the treatment side, you will have an increased workload for the patients, and that might generate some treatment adherence issues or some very strong workloads with mental health issues, for instance, for the patients with a chronic disease. If you do not push enough, you will have an increased burden of illness with complications or reduced capacities for the person with the chronic disease. So this balance between these two burdens is very delicate. But now, on top of this two burdens, you also have to add another layer for those who are participating into clinical research protocols, clinical trials, clinical studies, epidemiological cohorts, for instance. And I wanted to cite this article because it reflects our philosophy as well. We have to make sure whenever we put a person with a chronic disease into a protocol that we try to make this research as minimally disruptive as possible. In this paper, you can have an overview of all the issues reported by the participants in the previous clinical trials when it comes to the burden to understand the informed consent, the on-site visits, some additional costs that were not foreseen. There are many, many reasons why participating into a clinical research is burdensome. We have now ways to reduce this burden and to make sure this triple burden for the patients and the participants is minimized. And one way to achieve this, of course, is to invest into digital biomarkers. Digital biomarkers are, in a way, digital measures that can integrate the wills and needs of the patients. There is this very good framework from the Digital Medicine Society that we use quite a lot to define meaningful aspects of health, and then we convert this into concepts of interest, outcomes to be measured, and at some point, some digital clinical endpoints that can be used for clinical research. And novel clinical endpoints actually can be used for many, many different things, like remote evaluation. Think about pre-screening or screening patients for enrolling into a clinical protocol, remote patient monitoring, or just as an indirect proxy to assess treatment effectiveness in real life. So that's really the challenge we want to tackle here, using digital biomarkers to develop minimally disruptive clinical research. So that was the challenge. That's the general framework. Now I want to explain a bit more about us and our research, of course, and why we are developing digital vocal biomarkers for this purpose. So who are we? Just for those who don't know the LIH, the Luxembourg Institute of Health, Luxembourg is a very small country, but we have a very dynamic research ecosystem, and the LIH is the only biomedical and translational research organization of this country. We are approximately 450 staff members in this organization, and we are very much international with 52 different nationalities. So basically, it's a hub for Europe and from the international research community. There are basically 3 research departments, and I have the pleasure to head the Department of Precision Health, where we focus our research on many different things related to clinical research, epidemiology, and public health. And we have some very strong research axis on the use of digital health, data-driven, AI-driven approaches. And we cover various domains like lifestyle research, the effect of nutrition on health, physical activity, biomarkers discovery, socioeconomic inequalities, and human biomonitoring. And this group of 90 people, more or less, is divided into 10 research units, where the common themes are really real-world assessment of patients or the general population. And we use digital technologies to develop new biomarkers and new digital endpoints for improve and increase monitoring of these particular populations. We work across various chronic diseases like cancer, immune-related diseases. My main research interest is in people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. We are also covering neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease, mental health, and for the last few years, of course, with COVID and long COVID, this was, of course, very important for us as well. So that's us. And within these 10 research units, I'm also leading a lab, which is called Deep Digital Phenotyping, or DDP in short. And this is where we develop different research activities around the development of digital and vocal biomarkers, and also some digital phenotyping approaches, which is basically using data-driven approaches and all the available online and clinical data to improve the monitoring and stratification of patients and populations. So that's us. Now let's talk about voice, because this is the main topic of today's discussion. And you are very familiar with this approach, but basically now there is solid evidence that one day we will be using voice as a biomarker. We are not there yet, but it's coming soon. But in the first place, why voice and why not something else? Basically, voice is a very natural, energy efficient, cheap to collect source of information. There is many potential applications when it comes to remote monitoring, telemedicine, teleconsultations. It can be used also for stratifying populations of patients or the general population. And as such, can be used for precision health approaches. It can be used to boost the digitization of clinical studies, to reduce burdensome questionnaires or CRFs in clinical trials. It can be used for real-life ecological data collection. And as I said before in my introduction, it can be used as a digital clinical endpoint. And this is what we always say, your health goes through your voice. And if you know how to capture it, how to analyze it, you might get some interesting information out of it. Just as a side note, it's a very fancy research ecosystem. It's booming. There is, I think, maybe a new startup not every week, but every month on this topic. But the level of evidence is very heterogeneous across the range of this ecosystem. But basically, many applications are expected in the next coming years. This will happen for sure. And we are at the very beginning of this hype cycle when it comes to vocal biomarkers. We need to land at some point in a reasonable amount of time. And in a very simplified way, whenever you have a disease or a symptom, this will generate physiological changes in the different organs that are responsible for your voice production, your brain, your muscles, your heart, your lungs. And this will have some potentially subtle changes that you may not perceive with your human ears, but that could be detected while extracting this information with all the technologies and audio signal processing techniques we have at our disposal. So now we can extract many audio features and use this into machine learning or deep learning algorithms to predict what has been the initial disease or symptom that caused all of these changes. And now with some different techniques, we can extract thousands of audio features. We can use spectrograms to train deep learning algorithms. So there are many ways to tackle voice-related issues and to develop vocal biomarkers. At the LIH, we have been very busy during the last 5 years to develop our internal pipeline, which is very much centered towards the use of real-life recordings, real-life voice recordings in the wild, as we say. Basically, you ask someone to record himself or herself over the smartphone or the tablet or the laptop, whatever. But of course, it's very heterogeneous by design. You have a lot of background noises. You can have your TV in the background. So all of this is challenging when you want then to train robust and solid algorithms. So that's why we have developed an internal pipeline to check the audio quality, to correct, to harmonize this information collected in the wild to make sure it's something that you can analyze and use to train vocal biomarkers. So this pipeline, we used it for now the last 5 years for various projects. And I will just show you some snapshots, some previous publications that we have had in the group. And most of them were centered towards COVID. And I know that you have been also very busy with COVID-related research. So I just wanted to mention this work. It's a bit different from what has been published in the early days of the COVID pandemic, where voice researchers were trying to screen for COVID or to diagnose COVID in the voice. We had a different approach. We wanted to focus on people who had a PCR test, a positive test confirmed with an actual COVID-19 disease, and we wanted to see how we could use voice to monitor their symptomatic status over time. And in this paper, we ask thousands and thousands of participants from the pre-COVID cohort study that we have initiated in Luxembourg to read a pre-specified text for 25 to 30 seconds. And we use this as the raw material to train a vocal biomarker for monitoring the symptomatic or asymptomatic status. And it worked quite well, both in terms of discrimination and calibration. The performances were quite okay. Then we were also interested in checking for specific COVID-19 symptoms. And one of the most frequently reported was the loss of taste and smell. And we wanted to check whether this could be, in some respects, be monitored using voice. And we have also developed a proof of concept for vocal biomarker to detect the presence or absence of this particular symptom. And again, we had some quite good results. Very early on, it was clear for us that the device and the audio quality was a major factor. For instance, this paper, we developed device-specific algorithms to make sure we have a model that is reproducible for iOS devices or Android devices, which is a very important factor when you work on ecological recordings. Again, this work, and this has been brilliantly led by my PhD students, Abir El-Bejeshi had developed a proof of concept for a vocal biomarker to monitor fatigue, which is also the number one symptoms reported in people with COVID and now with long COVID. So we could use one-day voice to monitor fatigue and hopefully also fatigue severity and intensity using voice. And we use spectrograms as input for a deep learning algorithm that would enable to classify patients according to their fatigue levels. And because fatigue is reported very differently between men and women, and because voice features are also, of course, very different between women and men, we developed gender-specific algorithms to control for this very important factor. And that was a very short overview of the work related to COVID-19. But then in parallel, we have invested a lot of resources and energy to develop this quite unique platform that is called CoLive Voice, which is a worldwide multilingual audio data bank that we use to screen for potential vocal biomarkers. And we have standardized voice recordings and annotated clinical and health-related data in this large initiative. You can see on the map that we have now participants from all over the world. So far, we have mostly English, French, German Spanish speakers, but we have very recently added Arabic and Portuguese. So soon this will become available also as a unique resource to train vocal biomarkers in specific groups of the population worldwide. And we use this resource for many projects now. The first one I wanted to mention is a project led by my colleague, Dr. Vladimir Despotovic. He wanted to see whether we could track the respiratory quality of life using voice, because this could have a clinical application, and it's quite easy to understand for all respiratory diseases like asthma, COPD, COVID-19, as a monitoring solution for patients with these diseases. And we managed to work on this, and we try to replace or predict a questionnaire that assesses the respiratory quality of life. And we have fair performances, but I think with the progress and the increased number of participants, we will soon be able to improve these performances. And then I wanted to spend a few minutes on a very important topic for me, because those working in the field of vocal biomarkers, they know how big the potential is when it comes to neurodegenerative disorders, Parkinson, Alzheimer's disease, mental health, for instance, or respiratory diseases. These are the obvious candidates for working with voice. But in our lab, we are also investigating how we could use voice for less obvious outcomes. And one of them is diabetes, which is my main research area initially. And we developed a first project on type 2 diabetes screening using voice. And we wanted to see whether we have sufficient information in the voice to screen or detect first the diabetes status, and one day develop a voice-based screening solution. So we worked on the US population, because we have a large pool of US participants in Colli Voice. And we wanted to compare our performances with questionnaire-based solutions that are used for screening for people, for at-risk individuals of type 2 diabetes. The first thing we have done in these different steps was to show that people with diabetes have different voice signatures than the general population. We just age and gender matched some people with diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2, and no diabetes. And we managed to separate them according to their voice features. And this was very interesting for us and reassuring for us to see that there is something in voice that is related to diabetes. In parallel, some other researchers have published some more physiologically oriented research around the impact of diabetes on voice. And there are many mechanisms that could justify why voice can be a good source of information for detecting and maybe monitoring diabetes one day. The next step was to try to use voice to classify people with diabetes and no diabetes. So that's the current research we are conducting. So we use 607 US participants from the Colli Voice initiative. We stratified by gender. We took a group of people with type 2 diabetes and a control group for each gender. And we asked them, or we really asked them to use the text reading task to train a vocal biomarker for this. We have an entire traditional analysis pipeline where we pre-process the data, we extract the feature, we are scaling them, and we reduce dimensionality. All of this is very traditional. We use a cross-validation approach. And when you want to assess the performances of such an algorithm, you have basically two options. One, you try to stratify and control for each major factor that can influence the performances, like the gender, your age, the comorbidities. Or the alternative option is to try to train a model for everyone, and then you stratify the performances, you assess the performances according to these different groups. So this is what we did for this particular work. Just in terms of baseline or characteristics of this study population, basically there were people without type 2, they were a bit younger, with 40 as an average. People with type 2 diabetes, they were closer to 50. And they have a BMI of 35 for women and 32.8 for men. We have diversity in the ethnicity. The HbA1c levels for people with diabetes were quite okay. And we use this as the training set for the vocal biomarker. That's the performances we have obtained so far. So I won't go into the details. The best ones were around accuracy of 0.70 something, between 70 and 75. And it worked a bit better in males than females. But then the interesting thing is that we have shown with this approach that it's doable to separate the status of these participants according to their diabetes status, yes or no. And this is the distribution of the voice-based screening tool, so to speak, that we have developed. And you can see that basically it works. We can discriminate between the two populations, but there are some specific cases where it doesn't work for now. Interestingly, we have also shown some interesting subgroups that are clinically relevant that can inform us on which subgroup of the population we could use this particular algorithm. For instance, older people, they have a higher performances for this vocal biomarker. People with hypertension, which is a very frequent comorbidity of type 2 diabetes. People with depression are also an interesting group where you have higher performances overall. And in male hypertension and smoking were also very interesting subgroups that we have identified where the performances were a bit better. And coming back to the initial question, we wanted to compare ourselves with voice compared to traditional screening solutions based on questionnaires. And we have shown a very good agreement between our performances and the performances of questionnaire, because they are not perfect either. There are biases. Some groups are better captured by these questionnaires than others. So overall, we have shown a good agreement between our solution based on voice and the one with a questionnaire, and both in females and males, actually. So this work is a very first step for us. It will be a long process, of course, but it's very reassuring for us to see that there is something that we can do with voice for people with diabetes. This particular work is, to our knowledge, the largest sample so far. And we have used a standardized voice recording that can be reproduced in real-life settings. We have shown fair to good performances and identified some very interesting subgroups where these voice-based screening solutions could be of higher performance. We have shown that there are some gender-specific issues that we need to control for, and the strong agreement with the ADA, so the questionnaire risk scores. Of course, on the negative side, for now, it's based only on English speakers. We have to see how this can be generalized to other populations, other languages. And for this, we need, of course, more diverse data sets. All right, so in a nutshell, that's why we want to use vocal biomarkers. You may have understood from our previous work that we want either to use it for detecting or screening health issues or monitoring patients with confirmed disease, for instance, and monitoring either diseases or symptoms. And coming back to this particular case of clinical research, it can be used as a new digital endpoint. If validated, of course, we are not there yet, but this is the end game. We want to use voice as first as a secondary endpoint in clinical research, and maybe one day even as a primary endpoint. And all in all, we hope that with this, we will increase the screening capacities, because there is a lot of, I don't know if you know, but in clinical research, a lot of failures to recruit the right profile, or the costs, the money invested in recruiting participants for trials is substantial. So we have ways to facilitate or diversify the screening that will be very helpful to reduce the on-site visits. It will reduce the burden for the patients and also the healthcare professionals and the investigators. And maybe we could see some early signals in the voice that could be identified, that could be used to identify early outcomes, early signals that would show the benefit of a treatment or an intervention. But of course, as I said in my title, we are not there yet. There are many challenges to overcome, many hurdles, and this is just a few. It's probably not exhaustive, but so far, vocal biomarker research for me is the wild, wild west. There is a total lack of standardization. There are many biases, and I will come back to this in a minute. The unspecificity of some voice features, many features have been identified, but they are related to many outcomes. So it's difficult to make sure that whatever we develop is specific enough for the use case. We are lacking longitudinal vocal recordings for intra-individual monitoring. That's very important. That's the next step in this field. We need now to move away from just one-shot recordings and have multiple recordings at a very fine scale for patients. There is, like any AI-related field, the reproducibility crisis. Usually we have some fancy publications, but whenever you try to replicate this, the performances usually drop. And that's probably also related to the fact that we need better access to high quality data. And then once we have all of this, how do we implement this in clinical research first and then in clinical practice? This is also sometimes overlooked because it's not easy. And of course, now with all the regulation coming, like the AI Act in Europe, for instance, we need to make sure whatever we do is compliant with the existing and upcoming regulations. The privacy preserving issues, the data security aspects are fundamental when it comes to voice. So for the last part of my presentation, I just want to go through all of this and see how we could work and improve the situation. First, overcoming the biases. This is a publication that is really nice. I really loved it because it shows the different steps and stages where you have potential biases. And it starts, of course, from the very beginning, formulating the research problem, the research question. You can induce biases from the very beginning. The data collection is fundamental. Sometimes we are working on a very selected population, and once you try to transfer it to another one, it fails. The data pre-processing aspect for voice, it's very important. The way you handle your data can have dramatic impacts on the final performances, and how you validate and develop the models also will have tremendous effects on the performances. And I'm not talking even about how you implement it with some drift in the concepts, the populations, or the use cases when you implement it in real life compared to how it has been developed in the first place. So these are the challenges we need to overcome in this field. So one way of working around this is also to try to move away of traditional binary classification, because we know diseases are by design very heterogeneous. When I'm talking about diabetes, within the diabetes category, there's many, many different subgroups and subtypes or subphenotypes of diabetes. In mental health, it's the same thing. When you talk about people with clinical diagnosis of depression, it's actually very complex, and you need to control for this in some respects. So one of the interesting projects we have started with my colleague, Vincent Martin, he's a postdoc in my lab. His assumption is, rather than working on binary outcome like depression, no depression, he will work on the symptoms and try to combine the voice analysis with some symptom network analysis. And this, I think, is a clever way to overcome the unspecificity of voice features, but see how voice can be used to estimate different health parameters and overall assessing the general health status of a patient. His project, which is funded by the European Marie Curie Fellowship, is dedicated to monitoring mental health in women with breast cancer, and is using the Colli Voice dataset to do this. And yeah, that's in a nutshell the approach. Rather than focusing on one specific symptom, on one specific binary outcome, we are having a more holistic view on mental health and breast cancer, for instance. And we try to combine symptoms, network analysis with voice analysis, to improve the detection and monitoring of these health issues. Then I wanted to mention this. They are on the other side of the Atlantic, but they are doing something very fundamental for the field. I don't know if you're familiar with this Bridge to AI Voice initiative. It's led by Yael Ben-Soussan, and they have as the primary objective to release standardized data sets in different outcomes like voice disorder, neurological and neurodegenerative disorders, some cancers, pediatric voice and speech disorders as well. And they are coming from the clinical world. And this is really interesting because we are coming from the epidemiological world and or the real life. And at some point we will meet in the middle. And if you are not familiar with this consortium and decision initiative, I strongly encourage you to have a look, because it's very much around building capacity for the field of vocal biomarkers to generate important data sets and resources that can be used for training algorithms and to improve, and hopefully one day to have a clinical application of vocal biomarkers. I've mentioned that once we will have the best algorithms out there, it will not be obvious how to translate this into clinical implementation, clinical practice. So that's why in our lab, we are investing also some resources to develop some mixed method approaches where we try to go out there and talk to patients and talk to healthcare professionals to better understand how we could integrate at one day these voice technologies into their daily routines, because this is far from obvious. And this particular project is called PsyVoice, where we have analyzed the feedback from people with type 1 diabetes or their parents to understand how they would use voice or voice technologies in their daily lives for monitoring their mental health, and in particular diabetes distress, which is very frequent in this population. And this was led by my colleague Gloria Aguayo, and we have now interesting feedback from the field, from really the people that will use one day vocal biomarkers. And overall, the feedback is really good. People are ready to use it. They are those who are tech savvy are usually more prone to understand and be open about the use of vocal biomarkers. And some are sharing some concerns about data privacy or how the data will be, their data will be processed, but that's the typical thing we need to work on now in the field of vocal biomarkers. And also, I've mentioned that we need more standardization. It's very important to avoid this Wild West effect. And one way to achieve this, from our perspective, was to put everyone or the biggest players together. So that's why we decided to create this eVoiceNet network, which is eVoiceNet stands for European Network to Advance the Development and Implementation of Vocal Biomarkers. We created this network and with the idea of applying to a cost action funding. So we have not the answer yet. We don't know if we will be funded or not. But regardless of this outcome, this network will be used for future research projects to put everyone together. And when I'm talking about everyone, I'm talking about all the main stakeholders, being researchers, academics, of course, industrial partners, healthcare professionals, industry partners from the pharma companies or from the medtech world. All of them are on board around the table. We have also, of course, patient representatives, NGOs, regulatory bodies, and this will help us to push the field all together in the same direction to increase the level of standardization and to increase the level of quality in terms of data processing, research conducted in this field. And so far, with this network, we have identified some different subtopics, working groups. The first one is on data and methodology, how to standardize to further develop and validate vocal biomarkers, because now everyone is doing his own approach or her own approach. It's difficult to compare the results from different projects. Working group 2 was to facilitate the access and the availability of data, existing data. There are many open data sets or data sets that are out there, but it's not centralized or it's not known. So we want to develop a repository of voice-related resources. Working Group 3 is on ethical aspects, regulatory issues, and data security and privacy, because this is fundamental. If we want to have it one day implemented in clinical practice, we need to make sure that all of this is well covered to reassure everyone. And Working Group 4 is really how to move from pure research, fundamental research on voice and audio signal processing to clinical practice and the go-to-market strategy. And this, of course, we will work with all the key stakeholders in the field to make sure we can validate, make them recognized as validated biomarkers for the EMA or the FDA. And this will help to facilitate the implementation in clinical practice or real life. And of course, a working group on dissemination to make sure that everyone knows the potential of vocal biomarkers. And I want to conclude my presentation on this because it's very important. We talk a lot about voice, but voice alone will never solve all the issues. That's obvious, but I wanted to say it anyway. The future is very much multimodal. We have to progress with voice, but we have to progress also on the combination of voice with different signals, the clinical data, the biological data, all the omics, to have this complete 360 overview of a person with a disease or in the general population. If we really want to go into this field of precision health and to personalize the care or the prevention strategies, we need to invest in this and combine different sources of information. That's really the future. And with this, I first thank you for your attention, and I strongly invite you to donate your voice. It's open for everyone. You can just scan the QR code or go to collivevoice.org. It takes roughly 20 minutes, and you can participate in many languages now. And this will, of course, help a lot the vocal biomarker research. And with this, I thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, so that I can be heard from that microphone. So for people online, if you want to post your questions in the chat, I'm happy to read them. For people in the room, you can raise your hand. Any questions? I see a question online. Thank you very much for your talk. Could you talk about the speech